So you want to give those plants a chance to recover from having been disturbed. And that 3-day window is usually pretty good for that too. So you don't want to go much before 3 days because your weeds might not be photosynthesizing, and you don't want to go much after 3 days because then your crop might be coming up. So it's a really fine balance. If you know for sure that you can watch it and you're going to hit it regardless of the weather, which is not a good plan, then you might be safe. But yeah, it's a little bit dicey. And the other question, the weeds aren't up yet. Should I still, spray my pre-burn? I mean, we could go into the conversation about residual products versus contact-only products, but I think for this case, we'll just talk about contact-only products. And I would say that even if you drive by that field and it doesn't look like there are weeds in it, there are. Go walk in the field and have a close look at the ground. There are often little small cotyledon weeds, maybe some that are a little bit, obscured by the trash and stuff like that. I think generally there are a lot more weeds in the field than growers think when they're asking this question. And I would really encourage you, before you make a decision, to go and have a real good walk in your field and really check things out.
No, that's great. Ryan, do you want to maybe add a little bit as well?
Yeah, I don't think there's really much to add. I think maybe with some of the canolas, you have some more flexibility, obviously, because they're resistant at basically right from when they come out of the ground. So I think if you were to roll the dice with a crop, I guess I'd make sure your wheat is taken care of, and then maybe wait on the canola for weeds to come up if that was something you're looking to do, because you have more flexibility with timing and in crop you can hit it real early with your in crop and then take a second pass. So that's how I would do it, I guess, if you thought the weed populations were really low.
Yeah, good comment, Ryan. Like, if you do skip that pre-burn, make sure that you are following up with that in crop or checking that in crop maybe earlier than you normally would.
Can you guys touch a little bit on temperature for the springtime? When you guys like to see when it's too cold, when can we start spraying?
Awesome. Lalit, do you want to take that one?
Sure, no problem. So, I mean, it depends on where you are. We're going to start seeding when it's very cold, and most of the products that we're going to be using as a pre-burn requires some amount of warmth. Anything above 50 degrees Celsius is going to be good. But we should also look at what the temperatures were like 3 days out, right? So if you look at the forecast, and today's 50, but today's Wednesday, but Thursday, Friday, and Saturdays are going to be 60s or 70s, then I wouldn't recommend spraying today, but I'd say, okay, wait until Friday when you had a warm day before. And this is going to give the plants, because the weeds are going to be actively growing. And then when you hit them with the herbicide, then it's able to be absorbed better and be translocated better. So, temperatures are going to be very important, and you have different products that have different actives that will perform better in cooler or warmer temperatures. And like Corteva's Aralex is very good for cool conditions in the north. So anything with an Aralex is going to be good ahead of canola and cereal crops in the north, yeah.
I think that's a really great point as far as discussing how the different actives will behave too. Like if you're using a contact product like bromoxynil or AIM or, those products, like I think you probably will want that hotter temperature because you'll see the weed die a little bit more effectively. But as a general rule, Michelle, do you want to comment on like what are the spray temperatures that we want to see when we're spraying our pre-burn?
So with glyphosate, especially like with most of our tank mixes, we're including glyphosate. They recommend at least daytime temperatures of above 8 degrees and wait till that sun comes out. And that's when you're going to see the best results with glyphosate. And then probably stick with that 8 degrees if you are using a pre-pass or a prospect, anything Corteva, like Lalit mentioned, that RLX active. And then again, if you're adding anything else that's more contact, you probably want to be above that 10 degrees temperature point, which can be a little harder to hit, but again, waiting till that sun's shining. And it goes down to, when are those weeds actively growing again? For annual weeds, they need to have the same conditions as the crops to be actively growing. So they want warmer temperatures to be growing themselves. And our perennials and winter annuals, they are a little more, they will start growing a little bit earlier, so we'll take on colder conditions and usually still need those daytime highs of 5. And even your nighttime lows should be above 0 for those to be growing as well.
That's a really great segment into what I was going to ask next was, how long do you spray after a frost? What are the difference between like a killing frost and just a mild frost? So, Katie, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Yeah, we deal with this one a lot every year too. Last year we had a frost that was, I think it went down to -8 and it stayed that way for like 10 hours. That is a killing frost. So there's like 2 factors that are going to impact like how much effect the temperature has on the crop. So if it dips down to say -1 or -2 for an hour, you know, because of some of the topographical variability and different field conditions, a lot of the time that's not really going to be super problematic. It might shut a few of the plants down. You may, you know, lose the odd one. But if you get below, I'd say, yeah, now I'm trying to remember all the numbers off the top of my head. But if you get kind of around that -4, -5, and it stays there for more than an hour or 2, then you're really getting into sort of the danger zone where we're looking at more of a killing frost. And so even with a light frost, which, you know, I would say -1, -2 for an hour or so, that can shut some of the plants down. So just depending on what the conditions are like the next day, if we have a very cool evening or a really cool night, and then we have a cooler day that's overcast, I probably would recommend waiting to spray until the next day when it warms up a little bit more. Just because, like Michelle said, you really want to hit that kind of 8 to 10 degree mark. You really want those plants to be actively photosynthesizing. And if they shut down because of the frost and then they don't have the conditions to really like start them back up the next day, sometimes they'll just sort of idle for a while. And that's not when the herbicide is going to be the most effective. The herbicide will be, well, glyphosate specifically will be the most effective when the plants are actively photosynthesizing. Yeah, we did have some really severe sort of frost conditions up here. And when you get those really hard killing frosts, it takes a little bit longer for the weeds to sort of recover and start to regrow. If we have a frost that's so bad that you would see, like, say, a thistle, for example, or a dandelion, where the leaves are, you know, completely kind of crispy and have frozen sort of solid, then often you want to give it, you know, I would say 4 or even 5 days of really good conditions to get that regrowth starting, so that when you hit the weed with the chemical, it will actually translocate throughout the chemical. Again, specifically, I'm talking about glyphosate or a systemic herbicide, but you want enough new growth that the plant will take that in and move it throughout the plant and kind of kill the roots off as well. So a little bit, it would depend on what your targets are. I would say for most small-seeded annuals, a killing frost like that will probably wipe them out, but then you'll have sort of a new flush coming up. So again, that would be, you know, kind of wait for, I would say 4 or 5 days, depending on conditions, just for that second flush to come up and be ready for the kill.
So I guess just to summarize kind of thing, like really depends on the conditions leading up to the frost and after the frost as well. If you have like a lot of fluctuations in the temperatures, then you are going to see more damage in the plants. Whereas if things stay nice and cool and consistent, then you might not see that frost do as much damage, unless that frost is really heavy and prolonged for several hours throughout the night. That's great. Great information.
Make a couple quick comments here. First of all, yeah, I always tell my reps with biological systems, there's always tons of caveats. It's always, yeah, but, or in this case, you know, there are not very many black and whites when you're working with kind of biological systems. And I just saw in the chat too, Stacy, our sales leader from sort of Central Sask, had a great comment that she says, well, so I'm hearing that weeds need to be happy to kill them. And that's totally right. We want like nice, happy, healthy, photosynthesizing plants, and then we can smoke them.
I think too, when you do have that frost and you're kind of waiting, like oftentimes that weed will end up regrowing. You just want to make sure that it has that living tissue to take up that chemical too. And so that's why we always kind of mention that 60% green material remaining, because that really actually leaves an opportunity for the chemical to move throughout the plant. So it's, yeah, okay. So Lalit, I'm curious, what weeds are best targeted early?
Again, so it depends on where you are, because some people, it depends on what you did in the fall before. Like if you did do like a fall herbicide application, or you did work your fields over, then you'll probably have different weeds. And it depends on what the climate conditions are, the environmental conditions. You probably have some spring annuals coming up, like you probably have some small cleavers or some small hemp nettles or things like that. And if you can smoke your annuals like very, very early, then that's good, because they're going to reduce weed competition. Also, if you can get those overwintered perennials at your pre-burn, like your dandelion or some gnarleaf hawksbeard that had escape, then that's also going to be very good. So it just depends on what the weed condition in the field is and what you're looking at doing, right? So am I going to be going in with a straight glyphosate product, which is a systemic, and I need to see plants actively growing, or am I adding something in the tank that will get those things as a contact? So it just depends on year, location, and the crop you're going to be seeding in that field.
Ryan, do you maybe want to comment on your area?
Yeah, we run into a lot of annuals. I think would be, especially kochias are enemy number one. But we do have some overwintered, flicksweed and maybe some canola that overwintered, or early hawksbeard, things like that. I think the thing to keep in mind though is that killing weeds up until the day you seed, until about 2 to 3 weeks after that crop emerges, that's our time for a weed-free period. After the fact, it's just cosmetic and kind of revenge spraying. So the cleaner your field can be from day one up until you do maybe that in-crop application, the better off you are. So kill weeds often, kill weeds early would be my advice to producers.
I would say too, with some of those perennial and overwintering weeds, like thistle comes to mind. Potentially getting them in the fall is a really good time to do them too. If you can give them a big old drink of chemical right before they sort of go to sleep for the winter, and then hit them again in the spring, that can be a really good combination if you're dealing with difficult to kill perennial weeds. It's a really good option, and sometimes a little bit more effective than trying to get them in the spring. I guess the caveat on that too, though, is that it doesn't take very many cool nights for thistles to start to shut down. So you really have to watch in the fall, to make sure that your timing is right on that. And we don't always have good fall conditions for that. So yeah, but in an ideal world, getting them in the fall is really nice.
A specific weed that comes to mind for my area is we have a ton of narrow-leaved hawksbeard, and we're also very dry, so we're constantly worried about, preserving moisture and trying to use our moisture as efficiently as we can. Hopefully it's the crop that's using it. And so when I think of, for example, a weed that is very shallow placed and has a lot of those fibrous roots like hawksbeard, we tend to do kind of a double pass where we'll go in early with some glyphosate, and then closer to seeding, we'll do our glyphosate plus whatever tank mix. Just because as soon as those hawksbeards get like too big, they're really, really hard to control. So we have found that if you do have maybe some larger patches of hawksbeard in your field, that really early application and then following up with maybe that later application closer to seeding has been very effective. Another weed that I think of specifically that is a very inefficient moisture user would be flicksweed. And if you do have a really high flicksweed population in your field, it can be very drying. And so you will see that ideal seed placement will change if you do have that higher population. So we tend to go a little bit earlier when we see a higher flicksweed population as well. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add?
Yeah, I was just going to mention about wild oats, and I think that's something we kind of have been that hasn't really been in the conversation yet too is some of the granular and sort of more residual options that we can use in the spring as well. So with wild oats specifically, I'm thinking about Abidex as an example. And I think something to be aware of, we've talked about spray temperatures and frost and stuff and how that affects the chemicals that we're spraying, but we haven't really talked about soil temperature. And I just wanted to sort of put the reminder in there, I guess, that granular products like Abidex and Edge, for example, need a warmer soil temperature to start to activate as well. This is something that I learned last year that I wasn't aware of until I got a call to come and check a field out. So they really kind of get going when the soil temperature reaches about 8 degrees Celsius. Last year we had a very cool spring, and so the soil temperature didn't get to 8 degrees until like June. So just to be mindful that those products, once they do start working, they can sit on the soil or in the soil. Hopefully they're incorporated somehow. They can sit in the soil for a while and still be active. So when the soil temperature did reach that 8 degrees, we saw very good efficacy. But just something to be aware of, especially for growers in the north, if you are using those products, they require a certain soil temperature to be active. Very effective when the soil temperature is there, but something to definitely be aware of.
So
and
Katie,
wild oats could be a tougher one. Oh, sorry, Kira. And wild oats can be a tougher one too, just because they like warmer temperatures to germinate. So sometimes that's a later control target weed, and using a product with that residual is really in your back pocket to use, because it's going to activate when that temperature gets to the right temperature, and it's going to attack those wild oats before you even know they're there.
This might be a controversial opinion, but I feel kind of similarly about kochia in my area, in that we have a lot of really great pre-burn products that can help us get early season control of kochia. In my experience, particularly north of the 16 highway, the kochia doesn't tend to come up very early. It's not usually an early riser as we get further north. So in my opinion, getting kochia control is really important, but I tend to see a lot of kochia flushes sort of, end of May, beginning of June, even into the middle of June. So sometimes I think going in with a kochia focused pre-burn, we may be missing the mark. Like I said, controversial.
Yeah, because I would have the opposite opinion. Like kochia is always up before we start seeding in my area, so I guess it would really depend on your soil temperature. But in the south, I think we definitely want to make sure that we're adding in that tank mix too, just to ensure that we aren't getting that resistant kochia, because the kochia is usually one of the first things up in this area.
Yeah, it's a bit of mix for us, and like we're in the southeast, but we still not as far south as Kira. Yeah, kochia definitely has been coming up later for us. So trying to control those later flushes has been a bit of a challenge. So encouraging the mix of a contact and a residual, and like moisture has also been an issue. So with a lot of those residual products, you're relying on some moisture activation. So we haven't seen the control we've always depended on with, like, say, your Authorities or your Fierce and Volterras. So almost having to follow up with a contact just before seeding or possibly post seeding, just to control kochia.
What products or what actives do you like for that, Michelle?
When targeting kochia for contact, I do really like bromoxynil and your glyphosate mix. They do a good job. Important though, water volume is really important with those products, because you're relying on the contact, and kochia is such a small plant when it comes up, and it's a little bit fuzzy, as we know. So you want to get as much chemical on that leaf as possible, which might have been a question coming up, the importance of water volume, but.
I mean, just adding on to what like Katie said, like I normally see kochia coming up middle of May, end of May, when guys are actively seeding. So it depends on what field you're in. But if you know that you have like a kochia problem in a field or in a localized area, you could probably go ahead and do a spot spray with something that has some residual that will get the kochia. But it just all depends. And as Michelle said about water volume, that's going to be very important. So, I mean, I like bromoxynil too, because it's very good. But also will do a good job at kochia if you're going in at the high rate. So if you're going at the 40-acre rate, then you can get some control of kochia.
Do you want to continue on with the water volume then, Katie or Michelle?
Fire away, Katie.
Okay. I think that so when we're doing a pre-burn, we don't have a lot of the concerns that we do with in-crop as far as things like sort of canopy penetration and that kind of thing. So I know growers will often roll back that water volume rate for pre-burn. I mean, first of all, of course, the caveat is always read and follow the label. You know, we don't want anybody going off label. But I would say that a knowledge of your products that you're using and an understanding of how they work definitely will impact, what some of the water volume practices are. So Lolita had mentioned Prospect before. I think that's the product that's got Arlex in it. That's registered for a 5-gallon application, and so it's registered for much lower water volume. So if you know for sure that you well, first of all, that you're not growing lentils because it's got a recropping restriction, but also that you want to really reduce those water volumes as much as possible, like looking for chemicals that are already registered for a low water volume is important. The next thing that I would say too, it is, with the pre-burn, I think you are able to roll those back just a little bit. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat, which I'm sure is great, but I'm going to close it for now. You are able to reduce those water volumes a little bit and still have some efficacy, but I would say that those water volumes are in place for a reason. They've been tested, and so we want to stay on the registered recommendations for the most part. I feel like I'm walking a tight wire here, you know what I mean?
I mean, just to add to what Katie said too, because I mean, yeah, we should always be looking at the recommended labor rates, but for a pre-burn, the weeds are very small, they're not very big, so growers are kind of pressed for time too. So if a guy can go in with a 5-gallon and be effectively getting the thing, because it's going to be like how concentrated that chemical is, right? So how concentrated that solution is that's hitting the plant, that's going to be killing them, because oftentimes they're going to be small and you want to make sure that you're hitting them with a lethal dose of something. So if you can go in with a product that is 5 gallons or something, then that's all good, right? Because you just want to make sure you're getting good coverage of the plant, so you're getting good kill. And for a straight contact, you probably want to go a bit higher water volume than you would for a systemic. So it's just knowing your products and what the label recommends, right?
So on that note, so there is some antagonism sometimes with the different water, and they don't recommend really high water volumes with just glyphosate. So if you're wanting to get that better coverage, what's kind of the balance between, the glyphosate, but the tank mix partner, and just trying to find the most effective water volume?
I think if it's early and you got like a 2,4-D glyphosate or like some of these Arlex or dicamba, where it's all systemic, then 5 is great. I think once you start getting into a glyphosate, bromoxynol, glyphosate, AIM or carfentrazone, things like that, where some of that contact is doing more of the heavy lifting, that's when I'd start, bumping up to like 7.5. I think is a good compromise. A lot of guys got nozzles for that. But even something with like, let's say you're doing Black Hawk where it's got a contact in 2,4-D and glyphosate. If the weeds are still really small, I think you're okay at 5. I don't know if you're necessarily gaining much going to 10 to get any extra jam out of that contact. I think the glyphosate and the 2,4-D are doing the bulkier work, and that contact in there is kind of just a nice add-on. But if it was later on, let's say your seeding got delayed and the weeds are a little bit bigger, then I think I might bump it up, like I said, to that 7.5 to give that contact herbicide a little bit more efficacy. So small weeds and early, you can use less water. Systemics, you can use less water. If it's getting later and the weeds are bigger and there's more contact activity, like a Certitude or a Conquer, things like that, that's when you want to bring your water up to that 7.5, that 10 gallons.
I think it comes into question too, your water quality too, because the question, like sometimes glyphosate you don't see as good a control as straight glyphosate when you're increasing your water is because your water quality is poor. So if you know you have hard water, or even if you don't know, get that water tested, and then look at a water conditioner, or even AMS. AMS is the cheapest thing you can throw in to your glyphosate pre-burn to tie up anything in that water, hard water, and it's going to leave that glyphosate to do its job. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of AMS, and then that way you can go at that. I'm a huge fan of 7 gallons. It's a kind of a nice mix, and it's a little more water than 5, which I've seen poor results with 5 gallons on like smaller weeds in our territory. So I'm a huge fan of 7, and we have bad water, so adding AMS in there is the way to go.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have worse water than they realize. Just because it's coming out of the municipal well doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily appropriate. So, spend the $30-40 or whatever just to get a water test and know for sure. So there's lots of products out there. AMS is a good cheap product. There's other surfactants and water conditioners and things out there. So that'll help you improve water quality. It's the cheapest and the biggest thing in the tank, so you might as well make sure it's the best you can get.
We use a lot of soil residual products in our area, just because we do have some kochia issues. We do grow a lot of pulses, and so we do tend to utilize a lot of like those Volterras, Focus, Fierce, Authority. With a product like that, you do want to go at that higher water volume, whether that's doing a separate pass from your glyphosate, or if you're putting them together. I would recommend probably accommodating that tank mix partner of that soil residual product, just so that you are getting the most out of that application. So in those situations, we usually recommend about 10 gallons, just because you're trying to create this layer on the soil surface where you are essentially making a saran wrap layer. And so if you aren't getting that really awesome coverage of that product, then you are going to see some misses and you aren't going to get that residual control. So in those situations, I would probably recommend accommodating your tank mix partner more than anything. Okay, great question. Ryan, could you maybe comment too on, I know you guys use a lot of these soil residual products as well. Could you maybe comment on the activation and the deactivation of those moisture activated products?
Yeah, in my mind, I think maybe even activation is a bit of a misnomer too, because it's not like a chemical reaction that's happening. It's moving that chemical into the soil water profile and like you said, creating that layer. So it's not like the chemical is inert. If there's not enough water, it's just not spread out enough to. That's kind of how I like to explain it to producers. So in general, I've found, like, I guess just practical experience, that if it says it needs 1/2 inch of moisture, that 1/2 inch of moisture at one shot is way better than 2/10, 3 times, as far as moving it into that soil and controlling weeds and forming that barrier. And that, if you're concerned about whether it worked or not, then definitely make sure you pull out a little trowel and dig down. I think some of these products work a little bit better than we give it credit for sometimes. And then we have also seen them, if the moisture comes late, it's not like it's, if it didn't maybe activate in late April, early May, like we would like it, that's still there. It will activate. It will come on later in the year, but again, maybe a little bit more spotty and variable control again. So you mentioned previously, accommodating that soil active in your tank mix. I really think it's almost to the point where you got to look at it as 2 applications. If you didn't get it down in the fall, you got to get it down early in the spring, and probably earlier than you would like for any other tank mix partner. So, find a formulation that doesn't require a surfactant, or get some egg surf or whatever surfactant to make it work properly, and treat it as 2 applications. And as soon as the field can support the weight of the sprayer, then you should be putting these products down and getting them in the field. That'll give you the most consistency, moving it through into the water, soil, and spreading it out and forming that barrier.
We really got lucky with some very timely rains here last year. So I had a trial that I got to see, what kind of ideal activation looks like. And yeah, Ryan, I absolutely agree that the activation term really is just a matter of getting it into the soil solution so it's available. I would say something to watch out for on these products is they're definitely not going to be good with overwintered or perennial weeds at all. I saw a lot of sow thistle breaking through in my particular trial. And yeah, again, Ryan, I agree. If they don't get into solution or activated, they can sort of hang out in the field for a while and become active later. I think that the issue there too is that they're not really going to have a lot of activity on any weeds that are up already. The group 15, the graminicide that's in some of these residual herbicide products, can have some activity on some weeds, mostly grassy weeds, be taken up by the roots, but primarily these products aren't really going to have any activity on weeds that are up. So if we do get activation in early or late June even, we're just not going to have any activity on those weeds that are already up. It'll stop future sort of flushes, but it won't take down any weeds that are already germinated. And I guess just one other comment I would make, I'm a huge fan of putting these down in the fall. I mean, granted, we don't always have a nice open fall with the ability to do this, but if you're able to, and I would say that if a grower is considering using these products, I would strongly encourage them to consider doing a fall app, because I really think that in that way you get much better sort of a guarantee of them working, just because the snow melt will serve to take that into the soil solution. And so I really am a big fan of these residual products in the fall for sure.
I would just add to that, we did see, like everyone's discussed so far, is you need to have that chemical actually in a solution in order for the weeds to take it up. And that's essentially what activation is. We did see that sometimes when the soil would dry out, that chemical would become rebound to the soil particles, and then actually it would reactivate once it got washed into solution again. So we actually did see in my area, for example, some kochia came up, and if it was small enough, it actually did kill the emerged kochia again as well. So if the weeds are tiny enough, and you do get that reactivation, we did see some efficacy in regards to that. But it would obviously depend on the weed too. It did that for kochia in my area, but it would depend on the weed and the specific situation. But okay, let's actually stay on the track of soil residual kind of products. So Michelle, could you maybe discuss your experiences with Olympus?
Yeah, to be honest, we don't move a lot of Olympus, but where I have seen it, it's worked really well. Definitely on foxtail barley or green foxtail or millet. If you've got those in spades in your fields, Olympus is an amazing product. I don't know what else to say there. I was really impressed with it, and definitely recommending it in those specific situations for sure. Especially foxtail barley, that can be a tough one. And it really did a great job. And we were just mixing it with glyphosate and going at that 5 to 10 gallon rate with it. And that's where we saw really good results.
I think it's a good option too for growers who are battling Japanese brome. And it does have quite an extensive tank mix list. Personally, I would like to see it go out with something other than just glyphosate, with it being a group 2, but it's a good tool in the toolbox for, I don't think I would recommend it on every field on every farm, but if you got some fields going into cereals where like Michelle has said, there's some millet or some foxtail barley, or we have a brome problem, I think it's a really good prescriptive approach. It does maybe hamstring you a bit for in-crop. You got to go Varo if you want to continue with the group 2s. But if you're open to using a group 1 like Horizon or Axial or whatever, it does give you some flexibility and does a really good job on some of those tough to kill grassy weeds.
It also has a registration of volunteer canola on it as well. And I remember, Michelle, you had talked about how you had liked it on the canola.
Yeah, I was just trying to think back because I forgot to mention that. Yeah, it did do a good job on the volunteer canola as well. So we weren't battling a huge, thick layer of volunteer canola in specific situations, but where we did have it, it did definitely do its job.
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, because this is a conversation that I seem to have had with growers a couple of times. We don't have a lot of Olympus that's going out in this area, although that may be changing because we definitely have the weed profile for it. Would you guys consider doing a spot app with that product, or is it a blanket approach?
Actually, I definitely would recommend spots. Like if you know you've got patches of foxtail barley around sloughs or specific areas, we were definitely it as an option, but in this for this grower, it was pretty much the whole field was really bad foxtail barley, so we ended up doing the whole field, but we were considering the spot spray. So yeah, if you know you've got really bad patches just in certain areas, that's a great option for the product.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. It's kind of like prescriptive, so you don't want to be putting it across the entire field. Plus, it's a bit pricier too to be using as a pre-burn option. Yeah.
On that cost note, though, it is actually quite competitive in comparison to our other residual products. And so I think it is a really good option to kind of like exercise and and as far as spot spraying, for me, I think it would really depend on what weeds you're really targeting. I mean, Olympus kind of came out originally and said, okay, foxtail barley. This is going to be an awesome product on foxtail barley. So to me, that would be appropriate for like a spot application. But if you were looking for that residual volunteer canola approach, then that would be probably a little bit more appropriate for like a spraying the entire field, because you wouldn't really know where that volunteer canola would be coming up. But Amy made a really good question as far as like, does anybody know if Olympus needs rain activation similar to Focus, or?
Yeah, no. Right?
No, it doesn't.
No.
Yeah. Unlike the Focus and the Fierces and stuff, it doesn't depend on moisture for activation, because I was actually going to say that. So with that being said, it's probably going to be a good option for guys who are in the dry areas who are dependent on moisture to activate those Fierce and Valterias that went down. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's more like Everest or Pre-Pass, I guess, as far as use and the way it works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gonna say.
Awesome. Okay, so Ames made a really good comment on saying Corteva has been going out and recommending this 5-gallon application for their water volume for many of their products, which is a change from the normal 10 gallons that we typically recommended in the past. So do we support this new direction, and why do you think that they changed? Michelle, do you want to maybe just comment on what you wrote, and then if anyone else has any opinions?
Yeah, so I just commented to Ames, and I know we get this question a lot, and people love to go 5 gallons because you get more acres done, and we accept that, and we understand that. When you can rock and roll in a sprayer across the field and get the whole field done in a tank, that's awesome. So I think it's a move for convenience, makes the products a lot more popular, that's for sure. I know I've got a couple people who they use Corteva products because they know they can use 5 gallons. That's the reason they use them. But on the other side too, like they still do work at 5 gallons. We still see really good results. So it's kind of a mix of convenience, and they still work really well. That being said, does that mean you don't need to use 10 gallons? Not necessarily. Like we talked about, in certain situations when you've got, you're trying to hit more leaf and trying to get more coverage, increasing to 10 gallons with those products is still an option and probably should still be considered on those situations.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I don't know exactly why Corteva changed, but I like 5 gallons, right? Because as I said before, I mean, the weeds are small and it doesn't require a lot. So it's how concentrated you can get that solution. I think it has more to do with droplet size, because you want.
We lost you, Lily.
Oh, sorry. So I said I'm a fan of the 5 gallons, right? Why Corteva moved to 5? I don't know the exact reason, but you want to have smaller droplets, right? So even if you're going in at five gallons, you want to make sure that your spray droplets are small, because most of these weeds are going to be very small. And as I mean, we know how the surface of the leaves are. So you want to make sure that you're having smaller droplets, more concentrated solutions that's hitting these plants. So I think, 5 gallon is really good. And as Michelle said, you can cover way more, well, lots more acres going at 5 as opposed to going at 10. And yeah.
And I think, as we discussed like earlier too, as you're kind of like getting further along into the season and the weeds are getting a little bit bigger, then it might, be time to start increasing that water volume. But, early in the season when those weeds are still really small. And I wonder if part of the reason for Corteva's change in stance has to do with having more pre-burns with that Arlex active in it, possibly. I'm not sure, but it does seem very effective at a relatively low water volume. So.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll maybe shift the direction from water volume and maybe go towards more soil temperature and seeding order. So what is your recommended seeding order, and what kind of soil temperatures are you waiting for? We'll maybe start with Lalit.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because it depends on what your growers have, right? It depends on the diversity of the crops they have on farm. But like if a guy has barley, I like to see him going in early with that, especially malt barley, because that's going to help him on the back end. Like, he's going to be getting away from the rains later in summer. So I like to see that going in early. Also, if a guy has oats too, I like to see that kind of spread out across the farm so he can go some early and some late. And then that gives him some flexibility to tweak his fertility that goes down with his oats. So, and depending on his fields too. But I think different crops require different temperatures, and I think 5-degree soil temperature is going to be good for most of the crops that we're seeding. And most guys are targeting 5-degree soil temperature anyway, so that's going to be good. But I'd leave my canola for when it gets cooler. And yeah, that's how I do. I do my cereals first, my barley and my oats. I'd go in with my canola, and then my wheat can go in between. So it just depends on what it is that the guys have on farm that they're seeding. And yeah.
Awesome. So, for pulse growers, where would you kind of fit pulses in that order?
Okay, so I have, pulse growers are going to be going in the middle, right? So we're going to go like, I'd say anywhere from the 10 to May all the way to the end of May. So it just depends on what they're growing. I can't speak for lentils or chickpea or anything like that, since I don't have those in my area, but I have lots of peas and faba beans, and I know that they're going to be going in like that time. But if a guy has both peas and fabas, he will go in earlier with his fabas because they take a long time to mature than his pea crop. So it just depends on what they're seeding. It's going to be different for each grower and each location, but
Ryan,
think
could you? Yeah.
Go ahead. What was your question?
I was just going to say, you're down in the South, things are a little bit drier. There is that, you have those lentils and you have those chickpeas, but then you also have that canola. So I'd be curious to hear what your order would be.
Yeah, I think the risk of frost maybe gets overblown. I think some of our crops are a little bit more hardy in that you should maybe be seeding a little bit, if the fields are dry, don't wait for May 1st just because it's May 1st. I think, if you can get out early, get some barley and get seeding, get some acres done. Then I'd probably go to canola. I saw a study out of Ag Canada just recently that had kind of showed the yield penalty for each crop, and canola late seeded has the biggest yield penalty. I think they quoted 1.6 bushels per day after May 15th or something. Don't quote me on the exact numbers, but it was the highest out of all the crops. So I'd get my canola next. Then I'd switch to lentils, and then I'd finish off with, whatever else I had in my rotation, maybe some durum, some flax or something like that. But if you don't have barley in the rotation, then don't worry about it and start with canola and then go to lentils and then just for moisture concerns. I think we're, I don't think I've ever, even when we've had a really bad frost, I've seen the canola come back and it hasn't as bad as guys are worried about. So, yeah, be more concerned about moisture than frost would be my recommendation.
I'm not that much further north, but I gotta disagree. I don't know. Up here I find canola, like it's, I mean, we do have some crops that do well kind of before the 10th, 15th of May. But I find, and maybe it's just a difference in the soil temperature up here too. But I find generally, over the last few years, really early seeded canola crops tends to come up into cotyledon stage and sit there for a week or a week and a half, 2 weeks, and then it just gets totally destroyed by the flea beetles. If we do have a frost, my concern with canola, which is kind of like a question of, like, I don't know, architecture of the plant, I guess the growing point is above the ground. So when we do have a frost, it's easier for that growing point to be totally sort of wiped out. Whereas with cereals and peas, the growing point is below ground. Last year we had that awful frost, and we had some peas that had been frozen, and it was kind of bizarre. I'd never seen anything like it. They came back with 2 different shoots. So where normally there would be one, the first one got frozen off, and then it had 2, which was kind of an unusual looking thing. So yeah, I see a lot of growers in my area doing peas or cereals first. And yeah, I like what Lalit said about the malt barley early on to try and miss some of those later season rains. I think that that's a really good approach. And yeah, I like to see pulses going in early as well. And then I would generally say in my area, canola is like one of the last things to be seeded. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, and I would look further down into the season too. Like, if you can avoid, I think we have maybe more risk of heat blasting. We have more risk of that crop running out of gas into July and August. So yeah, it's going to depend upon, I think, Katie, you're spot on. And if I look at, how my dad seeds, it's very similar conditions as what you have in your area. So pretty typical, but I think for our growers further south of the 16, maybe south of Highway 7, even right around Rosetown and south, I think that's where the moisture concerns start to outweigh any frost concerns. And I think you maybe have to, just because we can't see deep because of soil cresting with higher clay content in a lot of our soils, I think you gotta roll the dice a little bit more on canola. But as Katie likes to say, there's caveats if you don't have barley in the rotation, which I know a lot of guys do. And if you have barley in the rotation, get that in first, because we're all trying for malt, and it just does so much better when it's in early. So.
Yeah, I'll just agree with Katie for my Southern Territory, Balcarres area. Probably 80% of the time, if canola is seeded beginning or end of April, it's probably getting reseeded just because of frost or it's been mauled by flea beetles. So that's just why we usually see our peas and lentils going first, followed by cereals, and then canola followed last. And then, yeah, sometimes some late seeded cereals at the end if they can get the canola in a little bit earlier, than maybe some oats and stuff like that. And then moving into Raymore Vineyard, we probably don't start seeding until beginning of May. I'd say May 12th is a pretty average day for when everybody's going. And yeah, similar there, like peas probably going first, followed maybe by canola, mix of cereals, and finished up last with the last bit of cereals and canola. So, and that's where we see the best results with any frost. Peas are more, they can take a little more frost damage, same with cereals. Canola, not as hardy. It can take a lot more than we think, but don't like to put it to the test because it doesn't like to be stressed. And we don't like to have it stressed during that flea beetle season either, where it just sits at that one leaf cotyledon stage where it's really susceptible to damage.
I just see a comment in the chat here too, and so just to clarify my comments as well. Yeah, Terry, generally cool soil conditions overall will slow down all of the metabolic processes that have to happen to make the plant sort of emerge. But specifically with canola, what I've seen at least is that it will emerge, but then it doesn't grow very quickly. And that can be a combination of the soil temperature and the air temperature, maybe moisture concerns, things like that. But I just find when things are planted a little bit later, even that change of a few degrees in the night temperature or the soil temperature can really speed the process along. And so we go very quickly from cotyledon to sort of the 2-leaf stage where we're safe from flea beetles, versus in colder conditions where the canola tends to come up and then sort of just sit there. And I think that maybe that kind of plays into a comment on seed treatment as well. And I'm just kind of going off the cuff here. But I think, I've heard the comment from lots of growers that like, oh, we'll treat the first cereals that we put in, but not the later stuff. Is that something that you guys have run into? Personally, I don't think it's a good practice. I think all the cereals that you're putting in should be treated. I would say that when they're going into cold soil, the potential for them to sit in the soil longer before they really get, moving is definitely there. But I would still strongly encourage growers to treat all of their cereals. I just wonder if you guys have run into that practice too.
Yeah, I definitely heard it, and I'm a huge fan of treat the cereals and treat everything. Like for the past 2 years, we've been seeding into really cold soils worse than normal. So that's where you find disease issues and where, yeah, that plant's going to sit there for a while and be a lot more susceptible to stress. And just having that seed treatment on everything is just another insurance that you have.
Yeah, I would agree. You often hear, well, we had good seed or there's good germ or I don't need to treat, conditions are good. But insects love warm, moist soils just as much as the seed does. If it's cold and dry, Rhizoctonia can come along, right? So there's never any conditions where it's like, oh, well, I have this soil condition, so there's no threat from an insect or a disease. The most important input that we have is the seed. Can't grow much of a crop without the seed, so you should take every opportunity to protect it and give it as much opportunity to grow a healthy, vigorous crop as you can. Give yourself the best emergence as you can. So yeah, I can see the argument maybe for saving a few dollars, but there's probably maybe some better places to reduce costs if that's your reasoning behind not treating. I think if you did some side-by-sides in your own field to prove it to yourself, you would see that treated seed later on in the season when it's nice and warm and everything's coming up faster is going to come up better. It's going to come up as a better crop and just be better for you throughout the season. So.
And I think Ryan said it at the beginning, 5 degrees soil temperature is like the target to start for majority of crops. Of course, 10 degrees is the ultimate, but that doesn't happen very often early on in spring.
Yeah, that takes forever.
Yeah, that's true, Michelle. That's why I like seeing canola going in anywhere after the 15th of May when it's like super warmer, and then they come up real faster, and you don't have that lag period that Katie mentioned, so they just come up, move from cotyledon quickly into the first true leaf stage, and it just gives the crop a better thing. That's been my experience, so yeah.
And if you're and if you're measuring soil temperature, like just get like a cheap meat probe that you buy at the dollar store. I think they're like $1, and like measure where your seeding depth is going to be, and measure in different parts of the field and at different times of the day, just so you can get a good average.
Yeah, I really like the digital ones. If you can find a digital thermometer, that is my preference. And then the other thing too, which I think is kind of a misconception, is don't just like shove it into the ground. You actually want to measure the depth that you'll be seeding at. So dig down a little hole and measure, horizontally, what is the temperature at, an inch maybe, or wherever you're intending to go. I just kind of a really general comment on soil temperature too. It's my understanding, and you guys feel free to jump in on this too if I'm mistaken, but a lot of the microbial processes that are happening in the soil don't really sort of start, like functioning or happening very quickly until about 8 degrees. That's sort of that like golden temperature where a lot of the microbial processes in the soil kind of kick on or like kick in a high gear. And so that's a really important sort of number when you're thinking about what's going on in the soil. And so when I'm talking about those microbial processes, I mean things that, like for example, convert nutrients into plant available forms and that kind of stuff. It's not to say that below the temperature that those processes don't exist at all. They happen just at a much slower rate. And at 8 degrees, things really start to take off.
Yeah, so that kind of ties in, Katie, to if you're relying on straight inoculant on your peas for your nitrogen supply, you're not going to be very happy because, yeah, that microbial activity is not going to be kicking in until later, and it takes a while for those nodules to form on peas. So that's where it's important to have a good fertility plan with the seed row and close to that seed so the peas have a good start before that nodulation starts to get going. Side note.
All right. Awesome. I guess just to give the opinion of the South, I like to seed my canola early because we have major issues with heat blasting. We have a nice long season where we can kind of use some of those longer maturing varieties as well. So I especially like to put those in early. I think there's just some different management considerations you need to have when you are deciding to seed your canola early. So there is that lag period. It does happen where that cotyledon to two-leaf stage can take a little bit longer. So you do need to be prepared for some flea beetle issues, whether that's, having something set up where you have someone that's going to go out there and scout, or you have maybe a little bit of extra seed treatment on your canola seed, just knowing that you are going to seed it early. You can take some approaches like that, like maybe getting some lumiderm or some buteo starch on your seed. The other thing is you tend to need to be prepared for that in-crop application a little bit earlier because some of those weeds might not be emerged before the canola comes up. So you probably are going to want to spray your in-crop a little bit earlier. And then the other thing is if you're seeing a lot of fluctuation in the temperatures, like it's getting warm and then it's cold and then it's getting really warm again, that's where you'll see the most damage from frost. So as long as conditions stay nice and cool, similar to what we talked about with the pre-seed spraying temperatures, as long as it stays cool throughout the whole thing, then your canola plant can become a little bit hardier. And so it will withstand some of those frosts, but this is specific more so to the South where we are seeding April 20th. And so we typically start with a little bit of cereals. I tend to like to break up my durum just so that if Fusarium head blight becomes a concern, we do have that wider window to spray. So I'll usually start with some durum or some barley. Then I'll go to either some lentils or canola. And then kind of I finish off with durum at the end too, just to break up that durum window. But I guess I just was kind of curious, what would you guys say would be the appropriate time that people can start edge? Like we are starting to see some, like all the snow is starting to melt and we are seeing those warmer temperatures. So when do you typically recommend guys to start applying their edge, and what are some best management practices in regards to applying edge? Don't all speak at once.
I think, again, coming back to that soil sort of temperature conversation, I think you can get it on early, but I wouldn't expect a lot of activity until that soil is warming up for sure. And I just would really sort of remind guys too that incorporation is so important with those products because they can photodegrade, which means the light breaks them down if they're sitting on top, and also they can gas off. And so it's really, really important to get those products covered up. And I would say as long as you're using those kind of good practices, you can potentially go quite early in the spring. I don't see an issue with that. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, I mean, just don't expect that activity to really take off until the soil warms up a little bit.
Yeah, I'd say get it done as early as you can. I mean, the Gowan recommends 10 days before seeding. Workload, it's a labor intensive operation, so you can't get many acres done in a day. So you don't want to, if you got 3,000 acres of edge to do, you don't want to dawdle too much. Just like your Fierce or Focus or any of those other soil apply products, I think, or I would err on the cautious side of being too early as opposed to too late. So.
Yeah, I think Gowan says as soon as that snow is gone and you're able to drive in that field, you're able to apply the products. And that could be used as a tool to warm up those fields too, because you're exposing that black soil.
Does anybody want to comment on the idea of letting the snow melt the edge into the ground?
No, don't do
That
it.
is not supported.
That's not a
Not
thing.
work. I mean,
It's not urea.
yeah, and it's not some of these other soil active herbicides, which even in that case, you don't want to be putting it on the snow. That's not how it works. I think that, like, as I mentioned, it's really, really important to incorporate these products. You don't want them just sitting on the surface. And I know every year I've got growers who say, well, I'm going to seed after. Yeah, it's better than nothing. But for the, you know, the price of some of these soil applied products, I really think that it's in a grower's best interest to do it properly. You'll get much better efficacy, and more of the product will be where you want it to be if you cover it up, as opposed to letting it, like I said, photodegrade or gas off. And I don't know how you would possibly incorporate it when it's sitting on top of the snow, and that's a perfect place for it to gas off and be broken down by the sunlight. So I think that, I think it's kind of wasting money, in my opinion.
Yeah, I know in our area that harrow application doesn't usually happen, especially with edge, but I feel you pay more of a penalty with Avidex for not harrowing as compared to edge. Like if you're going to apply both of them and you only harrow one of them, you better harrow the Avidex applied field, I think. So that makes sense.
That being said, Gowan did say that you'll see a 50% reduction in the efficacy of edge for the times that you don't incorporate it. So, I mean, to be rated for control of, for example, kochia, you need at least above like an 80% control rating. So if you aren't going to incorporate that, you would drop that control rating down to a 40%, which is just suppression at best. So I would definitely recommend doing that incorporation. Just go out once the snow is melted and once you can get into the field, apply it, incorporate it once. And even if you do that second incorporation with the seeding, which is a pretty common thing that I'll recommend, like incorporate it once and then incorporate it in the opposite direction of when you're seeding, you will see the best efficacy of those products. But yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, I would actually like to just kind of turn it now to what does invigorate mean and why are companies selling by seed size now? Who would like to go?
Because seed size and proper seeding rates is more important than I think producers realize. Proper plant stand populations translate into more vigorous, even crops and higher yields. And so, seeding at 5 pounds per acre is a good target, I guess, but it's when we have various different seed sizes, you could end up with 10 plants per square foot or 3 plants per square foot. And the same goes for wheat, the same goes for flax, for barley. Follow the recommendations for invigorate. I would follow the recommendations if I was buying a different company's seed and I knew the 1,000 seed weight. And I would always add the 1,000 seed weight or the 1,000 kernel weight test to my seed test and get that number for my durum and my lentils and everything else and seed at an appropriate rate and make sure that your plant population is where you want it to be. So.
And I think that that's the big thing is even though we're like calibrating the drills as like pounds per acre, once those seeds hit the field, like the point of seeding at a certain rate is not necessarily to put down X number of pounds per acre. The actual intention is to get X number of plants per square foot, right? And like Ryan said, that can really vary a lot. I will just maybe add another layer to this question too. I had a really interesting conversation with a grower the other day, and he asked me if variable rate seeding is something that I'd seen or heard of. I said I hadn't heard of anybody that's doing it in this area, but I wonder if you guys want to comment a little bit on that as well.
I've seen it. I think it's a solution to a problem nobody has, but if you have the technology and the ability to do it, then go at it. I think you'd be better off targeting plant populations. I don't know what you really gain by reducing your plant population or increasing your plant population on a hilltop, whatever the prescription may say. I don't know if you're really gaining much. So, but I guess if you have the tool and it works for you, I won't stop you. So.
Yeah, in my mind, just to diverge from the canola conversation on the variable seeding rates, in my mind, it's more of a tool for like salinity issues and increasing like maybe your barley rate that is a little more salt tolerant, and increasing that rate around those areas might be where it might be used. But that would be the only reason in my mind, and whether it's the best tool, probably not. Yeah, as far as canola goes, yeah, setting your drill based on your 1,000 kernel weights and setting that for that field, and then always checking that you've got the 1,000 kernel weight right. And if you've had to switch bags from like your B to your C, that's where you want to reevaluate and adjust your drill.
Yeah, and that goes for all the crops too. Like, just because your durum had a 60 bushel weight last year doesn't mean it does this year, and so it varies field to field, lot to lot. And I think the other important thing to remember is that you got to go out, at herbicide timing is a good time to check survivability, but the ultimate time would be right after harvest, and check which plants actually came up to produce yield. So then you know that, okay, yeah, I seeded at 3.5 bushels and I ended up with 6 plants that made it to yield. Okay, I'm spot on. Or no, I seeded at 5 and I ended up with 8 plants that made it. Okay, well, maybe I'm a little bit high. So the only way to know is how successful you are is to either count plants in the spring after emergence at that herbicide timing, or even better is to count in the fall, count out how many plants you have in a square foot throughout the field to see how successful was I. Do I need to increase my seeding rates? Can I get away with lowering my seeding rates based upon these conditions that I expect and stresses that the field is going to experience?
Yeah, I think the overall goal of Invigorate is everyone has a good experience with, no matter what bag size you have and no matter what 1,000 kernel weight you have, you're all going to see good results with that variety. And that's the ultimate goal with those varieties. I think we lost Kira. So
I was just going to pull up the list of questions on my phone. Yeah.
Yes.
But I think it might be time to wrap up. So if there's any last minute comments, Lily.
Yeah, so just to answer Kira's question, so invigorate is really a term coined by BASF, but it all has to do with seeding based on your 1,000 kernel weight for a specific target population. So it won't be invigorate for every single thing, but it's just using 1,000 kernel weight to help you to determine what your ultimate target plant population should be at the end of the day. Yeah.
And I think those plant target populations are very well established in the science and the research. There's a reason that these numbers are used, and largely it's got to do with crop evenness and maturity. There are a lot of things that are impacted by the density of the canopy and the crops plant density. So to think, I'm just going to tweak it a little bit this way to save a couple bucks, there may be things that are that can have unintended consequences when you either reduce that or increase it by a little bit. And so I think it is really important to keep those targets in mind, because they are have been researched and found. I would say cereals would be the place where there's a little bit more wiggle room in my experience, but with canola specifically, it's very well researched and found out that this is the optimum plant stand density for a reason. And so I would encourage growers not to play with it too much. I mean, there's still some some wiggle room, I suppose, but those numbers are in place for a reason, for sure.
Yeah, and BSF, that number of your pounds per acre is going to come right on the bag. But please, for every other variety of canola that you're seeding, check the 1,000 kernel weight and do the math and adjust your rates for those bags as well, because those are going to vary in weights as well. So, oh, we got Kira back. So if you want to wrap it up, Kira.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. My internet kicked out. Okay, well, if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to help you out. Thank you everyone so much for your time today. I hope that the information that we provided was valuable and you feel a little more prepared for seeding as it's coming right around the corner. And yeah, everybody have a great day.
And please feel free to let your Cargill rep know if you enjoyed this, if you like the format, if it's something that you want to see more of in the future too. We're always kind of looking for new and different ways to connect with growers. So if this is something that worked for you, or if it's something that didn't work and you really didn't like it, also feel free to let us know that too. But hopefully you enjoyed it. So I'm able to stay on for a little bit longer too if there's any last minute questions or whatever. But yeah, I think we'll kind of officially wrap it up. Thanks so much, everyone. That was really fun.
Thanks, everyone.